Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar today, hosted by OMLC. I encourage all of us to say hi and introduce ourselves on chat. Tell us where you're connecting from and also why you're interested in this topic today of bricolage. So for today, our webinar topic is on bricolage and implications for outcome mapping and outcome harvesting. This webinar really is to help us warm up for the flagship event later this year, which will be happening in Sri Lanka in December 1st to 3rd. And today we'll be hearing from two speakers, Marina Apgar and Tom Aston, who are authors of the paper which inspired the theme, The Art and Craft of Bricolage in Evaluations. So they will introduce us to the history, conceptualization of bricolage in the evaluation field and really dive into the big questions and unresolved practice dilemmas which bricolage leads us to. So we hope to have a lively discussion today. So we'll have a session where they speak to us and Simon will lead that. And then we'll have a small session on discussion, which will be led by Mariam here today and Richard. And then we'll have a Q&A session that will be led by Simon and a closing. So please stay tuned. Marina Apgar is the co-director of the Center for Development Impact and leader of the Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change Research Cluster, one cluster, honored the Institute of Development Studies. Or rather IDS, she's a human ecologist with 20 years experience working on the intersections of research, evaluation, and social change. She's passionate about methodological bricolage as a response to complexity and as a mechanism for meaningful participation and inclusive rigor in evaluation. So please help me in welcoming Marina, who will be speaking to you shortly. And joining her will be Thomas Aston, who is an expert in monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. He has 18 years of experience and has worked across many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, including also Africa, Asia, and Middle East, and also Europe. He is an editorial advisor board member of the Evaluation Journal and an honorary research associate at the Institute of Development Studies, that is IDS. So please welcome Marina and Aston, and also Simon Haran from the OMLC community. So from here, I will hand over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Esther. It's great to see everyone with us today. We've got some more people joining as well. This is, as Esther said, this is a webinar to launch the topic of bricolage. And we're very delighted to have Marina and Tom with us to talk us through their previous work on bricolage to inform our discussion amongst the outcome mapping learning community, which will feed into our event in Sri Lanka in December. So what I want to hear from Marina and Tom to start off with is really what is bricolage? What does it mean to you? And how did you arrive at this topic? Why has this become interesting for you right now? And I'm just going to spotlight our speakers so that we can all see them. I'll spotlight myself as well. Brilliant. So over to you, Tom. You've unmuted first. You go ahead.
Let me give you an idea of where I sort of started from, and Marina will give you her story. We've discussed this a bit, and it's I think these are always personal stories of where you're coming from, and more often than not, it's a combination of factors and experience that tend to explain why you came to something. So we'll just give you a bit of a sense of where we were coming from and where we weren't coming from. And we'll also give you some a definition shortly. But in my case, my personal experience comes from studying in an architecture school where the word bricolage is quite commonly used in architecture and urban planning, and referring to people like Le Corbusier, for example, famous architects who spoke of combining different repertoires of materials and things and bringing them together into sort of new combinations. And so that was sort of my memory of where the term sort of came into my field of vision, really. I mean, it comes also from different research traditions as well. Famously, Lincoln and Guber had written about it, and they referred to it as a fluid set of interconnected images and representations. I'm quite a fan of art, and so any connections and linkages to art sort of resonate with me as well. And so when Marina and I were actually writing the paper, we'd I think written 95% of it. And as you do, you check back and go, who else has mentioned this? Who else has written about this? And we'd recalled that Michael Quinn-Patton had mentioned it in his book Developmental Evaluation, where he has a whole chapter on it, which is a bit of a confusing chapter, I'll be honest. But I liked some of the use of the terms in there. So art and craft were things that resonated with me, and they reminded me of how art became a dignified profession. It became part of guilds and became part of sort of unions. And I thought that a really important point that both Marina and I were trying to communicate was about how to dignify creativity and flexibility that comes with recombining different methods. One other quick thing, which was to say that actually probably the first time I thought about this directly methodologically was actually in a training on outcome mapping in Brussels, which several of the people on this call were present in. And I asked a colleague of mine, Kaya Ambrose, about the vision step. And she said, well, we don't do that at CARE because we don't necessarily always have that scope. So we often go straight to the mission step. And so that sort of set in turn for me the fact that you can potentially skip steps, you can potentially substitute steps, you can potentially add things depending on what your circumstances are. And that's sort of where I personally got started. One other quick point is to say, the word itself is possibly not the most important thing. We've had other people refer to it as mosaics, jigsaws, tapestries, patchworks, quilts. There's a whole bunch of other words that seem to communicate something similar. So we're trying to be inclusive of this as well, and trying to have a conversation with the wider community about what this should mean and how we should do it better. Marina, where did you begin?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I guess for me, the starting point was when I was working kind of on the ground in the fields, doing my work with indigenous communities in Latin America. And I was thinking about methodology. And so famously, the anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, he kind of first, I think, used the term to describe, well, what he was trying to do was juxtaposition an engineering mindset and approach to methodology to the bricoleur, using the French term, right? And he was sort of saying an engineer comes with a ready-made solution to a predefined problem, whereas a bricoleur is working with what they have in context and is creating meaning through weaving different parts of things together. So quite a sort of pragmatic view of this is what it looks like when you're doing ethnographic work, right? When you're trying to make sense of something and you don't come with a predefined solution. And then, I mean, Tom mentioned that, Lincoln and Guber and others have written about it, a sort of qualitative methodologist. There was also, so I identify as an action researcher. So the work of Joe Kinchelow and Kathleen Berry, they talked about it, kind of formalizing it in qualitative research language, with the emphasis, they were talking about critical pedagogies in education research. And they emphasized the kind of plural stance that it opens up. And that, for me, resonates also with the kind of action research stance. Zooming forward into the world of evaluation, where a lot of my work sits now, and when Tom and I started writing the paper, for me, it invites us to think about democratizing evaluation practice, right? It invites us to have a more honest, transparent conversation about what we actually do as evaluators. And for me, it also really connects into a need to redefine or rethink rigor, which we can come back to.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. So you brought your ideas together at some point, and this paper emerged out of that sort of joining of ideas and thinking through what bricolage means in evaluation. So talk us through, what does the paper say about bricolage? What can we use as a starting point for our discussion?
That's me, I think. Could we maybe get the slide up in a second, Simon? Where we started from really was trying to look at largely case-based, theory-based, and participatory methods, and how, which was the ones that we would more commonly use, Marina and I, and how we looked about bringing some of these together in a slightly more organized and formal way. And we started to have conversations about really two things. One was, what do we actually care about? What sort of criteria, what validity criteria are we interested in? And I'd written a paper for evaluation a year or two before, where we'd identified several criteria that we thought were important for what we call monitoring evaluation for thinking, working politically. And basically that's sort of adaptive management and other similar forms of work. And in that we had criteria such as credibility, responsiveness, utility or utilization or utility. And these are sort of our anchors, if you like, for thinking about what should these methods be sort of aspiring towards. And the other thing that we started to look at as we looked at dozens of different methods that either we'd used or that we consider using, we used in part, was what was the purpose of different parts of methods. So one key point that we were trying to get to is, as in my vision example from outcome mapping, is that we often don't use all parts of methods, and very often there are good and bad reasons for that. And so we were trying to consider what are good reasons, what are good, justifiable, transparent reasons for why you might choose to take a particular step or undergo a particular process, and when do those processes come in as part of the process. And we came up with what you can see on your screen here, which is a sort of a synthesized table of 10 functions, as we call them, which are basically sort of micro purposes that different methods we felt were trying to achieve. And so you can see just several examples there that will be reasonably common to you, such as developing outcome pathways. Lots of different methods are trying to develop some kind of pathway narrative, with whether it's a theory of change, or it's something in contribution analysis or process tracing or something like that. There's usually something which is trying to do that. You get that with progress markers in outcome mapping, for example. Or you might, let's say, be trying to look at testing the strength of evidence or validating outcomes. Various different methods also have like a validation step, which is designed to triangulate and to corroborate and confirm or refine or reject particular explanations, right? And so what we were trying to illustrate with this is that certain methods are kind of more geared towards those things than others, and therefore they're a better fit for some of that. So for instance, in context, realist evaluation is very much designed for that. It has particular requirements around that, and so it's particularly explicit, but actually very few methods are really, really explicit about that. And so you can also consider it in terms of how you might plug in certain parts of methods or steps and processes to help bolster some of the weaknesses that certain methods have. So the aim was to sort of balance out the strengths and the weaknesses, maximize the strengths, and to bolster some of the weaknesses that we saw in some of those methods. Marina?
Yeah, I wonder, Simon, if now's a good time to play the video, actually, so that you can have a nice little kind of succinct definition, also fun to watch a video for 90 seconds.
Let me just check that the audio is selected because it wasn't. So now this should work. Scream at me in chat if you still can't hear anything. But yeah, so this is a video that's just been released by the Centre for Development Impact, which is ITAD and IDS and University of East Anglia.
What is bricolage in evaluation? Bricolage is a practice to design and implement evaluations. Bricolage is important for evaluators and commissioners because it enables us to address both complexity and rigor. Some programs are too complex to evaluate with just one method. The problems they address are often multidimensional, involving diverse stakeholders and with outcomes that are uncertain. In addition, evaluators are expected to generate evidence that is valid, transferable, actionable, and reflects local stakeholders' values. No single method can adequately do all of this on its own. To meet these needs, faced with multiple priorities and constraints, evaluators often recombine the components of certain methods to maximize strengths. We also skip, substitute, and repurpose steps and tools of evaluation methods to understand complex phenomena in a rigorous way. This is bricolage. Bricolage provides us with a framework to intentionally and transparently recombine and adapt methods, meeting the needs of complexity-aware, learning-oriented programs.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Simon. So yeah, so ITAD took the lead in developing this short video, which essentially summarizes what Tom was describing around the functions and the rigor criteria. And so one of the things the paper also does is to say that this is actually all about an iterative co-design process, right? So that idea of bricolage isn't simply about the thing, the design, right? And the specific bits of methods that you recombine. It's also about the processes through which you make those intentional decisions, right? And so there's a couple of examples in the papers, an example from Tom's work with Pearl and mine from work some years ago now with the CGIAR. And both of them illustrate how there was a layering of parts of methods as we went through a process of ongoing design, which is very much the case in complexity-aware evaluation. And actually, both our cases have examples of both outcome harvesting and most significant change. So for this community, I think there's a lot already that's happening. So just the other thing the paper does, which actually is an aspect that isn't perhaps discussed as much, and it's kind of taking some time to think about the art. So we often talk, we're methodologists, we love the craft, we talk a lot about that technical piece, but the art here is describing the process through which you make explicit and then navigate different positions and think about the power dynamics between the commissioner, the evaluator, the user, the community, whoever those stakeholders are. And so the invitation really is to not just focus in on which bits of which methods and how do I put them together, but to also think about how do I consider the different perspectives, and how does that then help build credibility? How does that then ensure utilization, right? How does that then enable responsiveness, which are rigor criteria which sit outside the specific application of a method or a part of a method?
So I think this field is I would describe it as sort of emerging. Not a lot has been written about this. I think we may see more written about it in the future. And it's something that is informed a lot by practice, I suppose, what people actually do when they're designing an evaluation and the kind of thought processes. So what do you think are sort of the bigger questions that are unresolved, or the dilemmas that are faced by the evaluation community when dealing with this idea of bricolage that may clash with conventional ideas of evaluation design?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. And this, I think, I think it's great that we're having this conversation now so that we can think about how the Learning Lab towards the end of the year creates space for grappling with, very much as you say, Simon, it is an emerging practice. So we hear a lot of conversations about bricolage. So at least one of the things that we've been in the Center for Development Impact and in other conversations we're having, we've been trying to kind of hone in on is which are the promising examples, right, of ways in which particular recombinations seem to work, right? So instead of going from here's 40 methods and here's all the functions and here's all the steps and put it all together, because I think a valid critique is that, but we can end up with Frankenstein designs, right? We're just sort of enthusiastically putting lots of things together. So, but yet we know, as I was saying before, our two examples in the paper talk about outcome harvesting and most significant change. We know that many of us working in theory-based evaluation often are recombining parts of realist evaluation with, let's say, contribution analysis. So across the practice, there are some of these examples. They need to be documented. We need to debate them. We need to look at different applications of these promising combinations to kind of move us forward and help provide an entry point for people who might also feel it's a bit overwhelming to think about any potential combination. And I think both outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, in the way that we've already described, they have a really nice backbone, methodological kind of process that can be a really interesting way to think about promising combinations. That's at least one area. Tom?
Yeah, I think the Frankenstein term is a good one as well in terms of how you could get carried away with this. So I think that's helpful sort of to reflect on both what sort of a minimum kind of combination, like more than one, obviously, is a bare minimum, but what kind of stuff fits together well, and what are the natural limits based on practicality that you find. I think one key piece of that actually is a question of reconciling differences and substitution. So certain methods have very, very similar aims around a particular step, and I think those are very fertile for reducing the burden, actually. Another key area that has come up and will probably continue to come up is related to the philosophical stuff here. What underpins the choices of the particular methods we have? So we'll use words like complexity and things like that, which display a particular epistemic view of the world, which might clash with other perspectives that other researchers and evaluators might have. So the extreme version of this would be a realist randomized controlled trial, for example, which do exist and seem to have philosophical clashes, but there are some that exist. So there's a question of under what conditions do they exist, whether the tail wags the dog, what's called epistemological imprinting, whereby one paradigm sort of overshadows the other. So if you're doing, let's say, an RCT, you can add in other things as you wish, but you're still straitjacketed by that design and what that prevents you from doing in terms of your intervention design and things like that. So a key issue that I think we've had is considering to what degree this is also relevant to mixed method approaches. So when we wrote the paper, we deliberately chosen methods that were basically what we would describe as case-based as a general umbrella. So that would be things like qualitative comparative analysis would be one, process tracing another, outcome mapping, case studies, action research, etc., all more or less fit within a relatively consistent framing or potentially consistent framing in terms of how we understand things in the world, how we can discover things, what can be known, what can't be known, things like that. And as I said, in relation to, say, complexity and how we deal with complexity. But we think that there obviously is some role for quantitative methods as well. It's under what conditions is that the case? And so what you don't want is for the tail to wag the dog. So if your primary aims here are to discover how and why things work, that doesn't mean that you can't use any numbers and you can't use statistics necessarily. It just means what are the guardrails for that, and at what point does that overtake your aims at discovery, basically. So that's one key thing that several of us are starting to wrestle with. But really what it's a question of is what's the right fit for what your purposes are and what you value. So when we said here is our rigor criteria, one key point that Marina and I stressed is you're espousing certain values, like we really care about credibility. If you really care about credibility, what does credibility mean to you, and what methods and tools are good for that? If you're really interested in use, right, how do you build that deliberately into the process from start to finish? There are certain methods that have explicit steps, such as outcome mapping, right? Also, and outcome harvesting, or both have some of that more or less explicitly detailed. So how do you take that as part of the process or the iterative process that Marina was describing, and also maintaining that degree of flexibility to reconsider at certain points whether what you're using, how you're collecting things work for you or not, and then maybe change course if they're not giving you what you want. So it's how do you do this in a way that doesn't put you in a straitjacket and allows you to accomplish some of those purposes and goals that you have. And one other quick piece to this would be to say that there may be certain plugins that people can use in a more direct way. So for example, in process tracing, evidence tests are one way to bolster, say, the substantiation step. The Roma guide, which some of you may be aware of, has all sorts of other tools and methods that are designed, I think, to sort of complement some of the backbone of outcome mapping. And so there's various different ways to think about this, but as Marina said, don't just turn this into a Frankenstein design where you just add or throw as much as you can in and hope everything sticks onto wall, because that's a risk. I think we maybe have one other area that I've sort of touched on, maybe Marina, on values and inclusion, maybe
briefly. And to the Frankenstein point, I think there's also some good examples emerging where we use the thinking of intentional choice and bricolage in order to reduce complexity in your design. So I think that's kind of the flip side of the Frankenstein. I think finally, just briefly to say that I've mentioned participation and inclusion. Tom has mentioned the kind of values grounding and axiological kind of entry point. But I think there's still quite a lot of questions, which maybe we'll never fully answer, and maybe that's okay, but about what's the right entry point for inclusion, right? So the Inclusive Rigor Collab, some colleagues I think are on the call. Bricolage is kind of at the center of that framework. It's one of the pieces of the puzzle, which assumes that there's a natural connection between more inclusive and bricolaging. But you could go down a more axiological, even normative, emancipatory stance, which would push you to go much deeper and to think about transformational forms of participation and inclusion, which could be quite a different entry point to a use orientation. So I need the users, the commissioner, the program team, and what they value to be driving who I include and how deep I go. As I say, possibly never-ending debates and conversations, but I think it's something that we need to grapple with more collectively if we're going to continue to make the connection between inclusion, axiology, rigor, and bricolage.
We've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to spring a question on you. Are we at the point yet of having any sort of practical guides on how to do this? And what would it take to get there? I think that might be a question that would be interesting for a lot of practitioners on the call.
Can I start? I think part of the answer to that is we've resisted doing that explicitly. When we started the process, I did a mapping of, I think, 40 or so methods and broke them down into every single chunk of every single bit and tried to figure out how they all fit. And I was like, oh, I can turn this into a tool. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't do that. Right. And the point of that was to say, yes, you could turn this into a tool, but this isn't supposed to be a purely formulaic and mechanical technocratic process because of what we said about the politics of making decisions about these things and what you value and how you weigh what you value. So Marina's point about values maybe not necessarily being in full alignment, or the relative balance between values and who makes the point about a certain value, let's say, brings into tension some of those points. One of the critiques that there's been of Bricolage is precisely that it isn't sufficiently technocratic. I think that is really poorly founded, personally, because these are about making reasoned choices in context. And as you said, Simon, quite a lot of this, or most of this, actually comes from not the top-down process of I've told you what the correct methods are for these things, but how different methods are better for different things under different circumstances, depending on what angle you're coming from. So what we've tried to do is come up with sort of a framework, if you like, which gives hopefully just enough guidance for aiding some of those discussions. So the criteria can be substitutable. We chose several that we think are most helpful for the kind of work that we are engaged with, but you could have different criteria. And so Marina and I have written other stuff about other criteria and how you might choose some of those criteria. The functions were designed to sort of root this in a slightly more steppy way, I guess you could say, in terms of like, well, what are you actually trying to do here? What is this for? What is the purpose of this tool? What is the purpose of this method? But the limits of that is, as Marina also said, like this is an iterative process. It's not simply the case of you follow sequentially from one to another to another. And I think we found from lots of methods that it helps to be iterative and to bring that into the process in a more explicit way. And I think there are other things that you can add in, certain other guardrails that we and others are starting to think about in terms of quality assurance, which very often relates to some of those criteria. Tools like rubrics we've found helpful, for example. So we've done that around evidence standards, which could be helpful. But what we've tried to do, I think, is give just about enough guidance for discussion and to make sure there is room for that discussion, and to not make it into a simple formula of our declarations of these are the best because we're the experts, because we don't think that's either helpful or appropriate. Even if we might know a little bit more about one step or tool or what have you than somebody else, we should all be open to question and to challenge, I think, about the why and the how. That would be my take. Marina, anything to add?
Just very briefly to say that I think in intentionally trying to build something that moves us away from being methods police, we then hit up against the challenge of, well, we can't codify it into a set of standards that we hold people to. At the same time, I would argue some level of supporting the practice is in a broader, kind of looser maybe way of thinking about guidance. And there's definitely sister, brother, cousin communities that are doing that. So the Inclusive Rigor Collab is thinking about guidance. Tom and I were talking last week about the Causal Pathways Initiative, which has also a set of guidance. I think in those different, very contextualized communities that have a particular purpose, you can move into something that is a little bit more beyond the framework. But I don't think we'd ever want to see it in a set of standards or a step-by-step how to toolkit, or at least I wouldn't put my name next to that if that happened.
That's great. And I think that gives us a nice segue into our next section, where we will attempt to start taking on this challenge of as a community defined by a particular method. We want, you know, we have engaged in bricolage without calling it bricolage necessarily, about how we adapt outcome mapping, use it in different situations, use it with different methods, combining it with other parts of other methods. And this is why we're so interested in this topic. So I want to introduce Richard Smith and Mariam Smith, not related, who are both stewards of the outcome mapping learning community and are both MEL practitioners in their own right, using outcome mapping and outcome harvesting. And Richard and Mariam are going to provide a bit of a response to this and to contextualize it for outcome mapping and outcome harvesting. So let me pop them up. So over to you, Richard and Mariam.
Thank you, Simon and Marina and Tom, so much. It's very exciting to have so many of people with us here today. Yeah, so Simon, you've kind of teed it up nicely as well. I think the first thing I want to reflect on is that for the outcome mapping learning community, the idea of combining, recombining methods and skipping steps, i.e. bricolage, is part of who we are, right? It's Steph Dupre back in 2008 actually used the term bricolage in a thought piece for the community, talking about combining outcome mapping with the logical framework approach. Then in 2012, it was published 10 years kind of retrospective on how outcome mapping had actually been used. The study I did with Cornelia Wassmann and John Morimoto. We found that the steps of outcome mapping, very beautifully thought through and logical as they are, had really rarely actually been used altogether. It was normal to skip one or more steps. Secondly, it was nearly always used, outcome mapping was nearly always used with other methods. Logical framework approach out of necessity, as well as perhaps out of motivations, but also most significant change, appreciative inquiry, and many, many other approaches. And this confirmed to us outcome mapping stewards, I wasn't a steward in those days, but confirmed to the stewards that this, what was already part of their practice as well, was really widespread in the community, and made us want to get away from the idea of communicating outcome mapping as only the steps, because it's really very much a way of thinking about change as well. It has core concepts, it has principles as well. And it took us some time as a community governing the outcome mapping learning community, the steward group, to then articulate. It was pretty much 10 years later, we did a paper, 20 years of outcome mapping, which we did a survey and found that the members were certainly still using methods together with outcome mapping, contribution analysis, social network mapping, vulnerability assessment, power and interest, stakeholder mapping, etc. And this drove us to then articulate principles of outcome mapping, key concepts, but also guiding practices, one of which is combining outcome mapping with other methods according to context. So not to say that all of this is old hat for outcome mapping learning community, because we haven't ever deliberately, purposefully really considered in a way that Marina and Tom have put forward in their wonderful thought-provoking paper, where they look at over 30 methods and use this rigor criteria and functional analysis of methods to help us make sense of how one could recombine methods, but to actually purposefully look at methods together in that way, with the outcome mapping and outcome harvesting as the starting point, is not something we've done before. So it's a very kind of timely, really, I think, to kind of bring together the experience of the outcome mapping learning community with this great thinking that you've been doing. So I really appreciate that. And just very briefly, on a personal perspective, From a personal perspective, I've talked from the outcome mapping learning community's kind of perspective, but from a personal perspective, as a self-taught evaluator who've learned my practice through doing, in fact, through being evaluated through outcome harvesting and using outcome mapping with a coach, and then reading, going on trainings, learning, listening, exchanging, discussing with peers. So I've become known very much for outcome mapping and outcome harvesting through that, my self-taught practice. So much so that that's usually what I get asked to do. So I'm very much aware of the wonderful strengths of the methods, but also, of course, that they're not the answer to everything. And there are wonderful universe of methods out there. So hence the paper which you produced, Marina and Tom, which you looked at over 30 methods appropriate for qualitative methods for complexity-aware evaluation, and looking at their functional strengths was fantastic for me, because I knew some of the methods, but I hadn't even heard of all the methods, let alone understood some of their possible strengths. So as a fantastic, I take it what you say, Tom, it's a starting point. It's not the gospel. It's not like you are saying you're the world's leading experts, most experienced people in all those methods, and there's a lot of dialogue to be had around that. But for me personally, that was a fantastically useful resource. And it made me reflect, using the rigor framework, on if I'm asked to do an outcome harvesting evaluation, for example, how could the rigor criteria inform a discussion I could have with the commissioners, with the primary users, to kind of engage them beyond thinking of a single method, like, okay, this is where outcome harvesting is really going to hit home for you. And here are some other parts where we could bring in some thinking, ways of thinking from other methods. And it led me to think, okay, you can bring in some process tracing, you bring in some MSC, you can bring in some contribution analysis and realist evaluation thinking. So you can be inspired by lots of different methods with an outcome harvesting backbone. And it also made me think critically about how far you can, the idea of meaningful inclusion, coming back to your point, Marina, and if you think of evaluation as a tool of empowerment as well, and using any method, you don't, even participatory methods, you don't automatically get meaningful inclusion at all. It's all about how you use them. To actually really include people from across the power spectrum in the design of an evaluation. How often have you been able to do that? I think it's all too rare. So it's not just the methods, but it's how you use the methods. And it kind of, if you have this framework which is outside of the methods, for me, I found that really useful. And my last point, before giving a little space to Mariam to share her insights, is on contribution analysis, and seeing that as not as a method with its steps, but as a framework through which you can bring in various methods. That was very insightful, and very much in line with this bricolage thinking. So I took that from the Institute for Development Studies course on contribution analysis that Marina and Tom, you were among the coaches at. So thank you for that. So I think there's an awful lot of questions in my mind still, but this already in my own practical work, I've been able to develop contribution analysis designs very much from this kind of bricolage approach as a basis of on what I've read and learned so far. So those are some very personal reflections from an OM student. Over to you, Mariam.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thanks for reminding us a little bit about the or how the outcome mapping learning community has been involved in bricolage already, and your personal reflections. Yeah, I think as you are, Richard, I've got my favorite tools and they have a reason why. I mean, I like outcome mapping and outcome harvesting because the way that I can use them to engage in participatory and inclusive processes. I've got some value bases. And then I've discovered along the way how much I take little bits and pieces from different things to strengthen some aspects. So when we were thinking about a learning lab and what that could do. I got really excited to give this space for creativity and acknowledge some of the wisdom and underlying values, and I realized that what I'd love to know more about is that essence of different methodologies, that and maybe some support from others who've come a lot further in knowing how to blend, and like Tom was saying, making sure that the dog is wagging the tail and not the tail of the dog. And yeah, but I love the humanness of this. We're not wanting to become something really rigid and by these standards that never really fit in complexity and a human people-focused kind of approach to evaluation. So I think we want to get together with others with other methods, other people who are like-minded, wanting to effectively use what we have to make the world a better place. And methods are part of that, I think. So yeah, so we have a journey to go as the outcome mapping learning community, and I myself really look forward to what we get to do with this journey leading up to the Learning Lab and during the Learning Lab as well. I think, yeah, let's give some time for the next step, Simon. Because I think there's some exciting questions coming in. And
yeah, we do have a few questions in chat, which we'll come to in just a second. Let me bring back Tom and Marina. Great. So questions. Yeah, we're welcoming questions. As I put in chat, please feel free to post your questions there. We'll take a few at a time, and yeah, I'll try and direct them appropriately. But feel free to direct them to Tom or Marina, or to Richard and Mariam as well. So looking at the first question we came in from Watini is, if not standards, can we have risks of doing certain things? So if we don't have standards, then what do we have in place? So that's one question from Watini. And then Serhi asks, I'm wondering whether we can borrow some lessons from qualitative research, mixed methods research, which have been talking about bricolage for a long time. Some of the issues discussed here are not unique to the field of evaluation. And then thirdly, I'll take three. Michaela, many thanks. I have a question that could be read as provocative. In evaluation, it's common to combine different types of data collection and analysis. Some of those combinations have been codified in the form of well-defined processes with a label. For example, contribution analysis, outcome harvesting. When we develop a complexity-aware evaluation design that combines certain types of data collection and analysis in certain ways that don't fully match any existing label, why would we still need to refer to the labels? Why is it not enough just to explain what we've come up with in that specific evaluation design? And why is it, and tell and explain why it's robust or not? Especially if the robustness criteria sits outside of the method, as Marina has said. So 3 questions, quite different questions. I'll let Tom and Marina to take that first.
Which one do you want to take first, Marina?
I mean,
what would you like me to take?
I mean, I'm happy to speak to the point around the standards. If not standards, then what? And I think it's an important question. So I think communities such as this and other communities are the place in which we have the space for debate and dialogue that can help us understand what this language of guardrails, which Tom mentioned, right? So what are the parameters within which we need to work to know that what we've done is worth anything, right? And precisely the framework tries to offer that through selecting some criteria for rigor, through thinking about a thoughtful process of making decisions, etc. So, and all of that, of course, is bound by, if you like, the rules of transparency, which is kind of maybe criteria number 1 that should always be there for any methodological design. So I think the push against standards is that it starts to codify in a way that it essentially kills off what Mariam was describing so beautifully, which is the creativity and the human element of this, which is central to doing anything well. At the same time, I think there is the risk and the challenge that we face, which is that without any kind of standards that can go out to everybody, it means that it's only the gifted few that kind of know how to do it well. And I think that's a collective challenge. So I would see the Learning Lab, and I know that there's a lot of reflection on ensuring inclusion and thinking about who's in the room. It's through processes like that we open up and we can move towards more kind of democratic practice. So yeah, it's not anything goes. And that's, I think it's really important to say that. As Tom was saying, our reflection on looking at the chapter in Michael Quinn Patton's book, which I reread recently, is that it might suggest that, well, just go forth and bricolage in whatever way you want to. That's not what we're saying. But there's something in between rigid standards and nothing goes. And we're trying to find the right middle ground to help guide quality in the way we do bricolage.
Yeah, I think my own personal journey has probably been one from a Platonist to an Aristotelian, and that kind of reflects the same the same kind of point about how do you find a balance of these things for different contexts, right? I think most of the methods that people on the call are familiar with are probably complexity informed and context matters. So context is going to be something that hopefully should inform whatever your choices are. We've been trying to, as Marina says, find a middle path between a formula or a spreadsheet distribution of these are the correct things according to experts, and as Marina says, Michael Quinn Patton's somewhat unhelpful chapter, self-admittedly unhelpful chapter. If you read the chapter in developmental evaluation, he says this is an incoherent rant which doesn't hang together, but I hope it's been useful in some way. And there are useful bits to it, and there are good things that you can take from it. And as you would expect from someone like Michael Quinn Patton, there are helpful prompts and stuff. But his reasoning for writing that chapter was largely to tell people, stop asking me which methods you should use for developmental evaluation. It depends. And so it's not anything goes, it depends, right? And so whatever your there's slightly different starting points for this. One would be the one that Marina and I have taken, which is around values, because we found that saying something like, if utilization really matters to you, that could be an anchoring value. That could be your primary guiding light, and you might have other criteria you really value as well to shepherd through that process, right? And that's going to help you at any point in the process decide which are my available options and why they're a good fit option. One thing I wanted to do was just give one example of a conversation Richard and I had, or a back and forth Richard and I had, on a particular step of outcome harvesting, right? Which we've gone back and forth on substantiation. There's various things. I think I've even seen this morning, I think for the outcome harvesting community, there's going to be a discussion which maybe includes something on this again. And I'd always struggled with the substantiation step or the validation step of outcome harvesting. I think it was largely because I didn't particularly like the tools that were given. I didn't like the way that it was formulated because I thought it would be too leading, and that I found problematic for different reasons. But the point is, it actually depends who you're asking the question of. And so what I found, what I learned from the discussion Rich and I had, was it depends who you're asking is whether they're going to agree with you and just simply checkbox your, is this the correct, is this a correct statement, or is it not? Different people will give you different answers depending how much power they have, how much they want to disagree with you or not. They may find it easier to disagree with you in person in some cases. Some other people might find it more difficult to disagree with you in person. So depending on who you're actually working with and what you're trying to achieve, the same step could be a really good idea. The same tool for the same step could be a really good idea or a really bad idea. It depends on the context. And it depends what you really care about and how much you care about it. So if I really, really care about credibility, and my definition of credibility has a particular definition, which let's say fits better with process tracing, then I'm going to have incentives to include something of process tracing to bolster that step. That may not be how I want to define credibility. that may not be the best way to validate, and it may not be the best thing for that situation. The whole point of this is to be able to reflect critically on, among the available options you have for the thing you want to achieve, so the micro purpose that you have, I want to, you know, have a better theory, I want a better anchoring context, I want better validation, or whatever it might be. For whatever that sort of micro purpose is, that you can reflect on what might be available options. And those available options are not simply do a whole method, right? It will be, as Mariam said, like, I have my favorite tools. Why do I have my favorite tools? How can I reflect on why these are my favorite tools? What are they good for, right? And what are they good for in this context is really the question that matters. And so what we're trying to sort of reconcile is, how do you make whatever it is fit for context in line with what you care about? And how do you have a reflective conversation, probably iteratively, about what are sensible, well-reasoned options? And as Marina said, be transparent about why you're making whatever choices you're making. There's no perfect choices. There's no perfect methods. Every method, every tool, everything has flaws, but they also possibly have some strengths under certain conditions too. So it's a question of, how do you highlight those strengths? How do you blunt those weaknesses for whatever it is that you're trying to achieve? I think there are ways that you can certainly instrumentalize this more if you want to. And just to the labels point, I was doing process tracing, but not in full. And because the people I was working with really struggled with terminology and various pieces of it, and I wanted to use some sort of a significance rating, which was basically inspired by either outcome harvesting or most significant change, or similar, that I'd taken from, say, the children. And it wasn't completely a method, so I just renamed it. I was using rubrics, and I was talking about contributions, so I called it contribution rubrics. You can rename that whatever you want. You can change the steps, the tools, and call it something differently. I don't think that's the point that really matters. It's, how do you have a thoughtful conversation about why? But I think the one caveat I have to this is, I think there is probably something helpful in the overlay of methods, or the umbrella nature of certain methods. So someone, I can't remember who, referred to like the backbone of outcome mapping, right? There's a reason why you have certain steps, and there's a certain coherence to it. And there are good and bad reasons for different bits of it, arguably, right? But you may want to have an overall structure to guide you, right? So contribution analysis, as Richard said, is quite good as an overarching framework within which you make choices. Outcome mapping similarly has a sort of a backbone that you can use and repurpose and move as you see appropriate. And there are other things that are more or less complementary for your purpose. So you could make them into toolkits if you want to, for your own purposes. It's just that Marina and I are trying to resist that, because we don't want to say, here is the finished product, go bricolage. The point is, here are some suggestions which we think have been helpful for our practice and others, and we want to have a conversation with you in Sri Lanka or elsewhere about, how do we make this fit for you, and how do we help you think about the best ways of making different parts of methods suit your purposes. That would be my pitch.
Simon, can I jump in response to Michaela's question, which I partly responded to in the chat, and I love the provocation, so thank you for that. I think it's quite clear by now that the invitation is to not worry too much about the label, right? And to make sure you're being clear, transparent, reasoned, etc. At the same time, I think that there is a coherence, a logic, as Thomas said, to different methodological approaches or different methodologies, right? And one of the things that's really important in evaluation is the causal inference framework you're using, right? Which dips into your epistemological stance, but it's also possibly ontological, or it's axiological. It's in a slightly different dimension. So I think understanding the generative causal framework under realist evaluation, as Mariam said, the essence, right, if you like, of it, and understanding how outcome mapping and outcome harvesting thinks about behavior change and complexity in systems is actually quite important to help you make good choices about how you recombine. So and that does, again, to what I've already said, poses a challenge to who then is able to do it or not. And to your point that in Germany, or as we've seen in other countries, it happened in the Netherlands, where suddenly there's a methodology of choice. You know, is it contribution analysis now or not? I think that part of what we're trying to do is to help also those who are making those preferences, right, to maybe also understand what it means, so that we can slowly maybe shift so that there isn't a predefined method of choice, but there is a set of criteria that matter. There is a request for you to be intentional. There is a request for you as an evaluator to propose, to be transparent about what you're proposing and why you're proposing it. So the values conversation, the criteria conversation, and using those, I think in some of the courses that I run where we have commissioners, they come because they're interested in what makes it robust, right? So just by shifting their focus from one method to another doesn't help them understand where quality sits, right? So I think it's equally for that community that we're talking about. And I know that there's a group of you in Germany who are working on bricolage, perhaps precisely to push against some of that.
We've got a few more questions. I'd love to also engage and pitch in my own thinking, but I won't. I'll resist.
Go on, Simon, do it.
Because let's see if there's time after these questions. So Julius says that project managers, stakeholders, and even evaluation colleagues will require quite a bit of orientation about what bricolage combination will best serve their interests. And there's time and resource implications on this. And he suggests Michael Quinn Patton's utilization-focused evaluation could provide a useful window for intentional OM and OH designs. I didn't see the question there, Julius, but an interesting contribution. Jelena says, I was wondering, what would you say is different between mixed methods and bricolage? In which ways are you critical in doing research, especially because critical stance is needed in bricolage? And then we'll take just one more from Neil. While I appreciate the desire is to not impose a Platonic form of what good bricolage looks like, it would still be great to have some Aristotelian examples. Did any good, bad examples stand out in your review? What stood out to you as successful, unsuccessful in these cases?
Should I do mixed methods, maybe, and you do Aristotle, Marina? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Should I go for that?
Go ahead.
So I think there's still a question of how we define the differences between mixed methods and bricolage, insofar as I think you can have mixed methods bricolage. Generally speaking, mixed methods tends to be along the lines of qualitative and quantitative combinations. It doesn't need to be thus for bricolage. Where we started with bricolage was probably better described as a multi-method approach, which actually really is multi-tool approach, because or multi-step or multi-functional approach, maybe slightly better, because what we were trying to do was break it down into the component pieces of methods and seeing what combinations might be a good idea or a bad idea. So they're not necessarily in friction, but I think sort of multi-method or multifunctional is probably a better description of what bricolage is trying to achieve. And I think that the key difference probably from prior efforts was we weren't, as per Richard's example, going, it's pretty common practice, and probably for good reason, that not everybody does every single step in outcome mapping, or most significant change for that matter, or lots of other methods. And we wanted to say, maybe that's okay. Maybe there are good reasons for that. What are the reasons for that? What might that look like? And how do we wrestle with that? And how do we provide enough guidance about what the fundamentals of certain methods and approaches might be, whether it's, as Marina says, causally or process-wise or other. One quick example I give would be the key for realist evaluation is probably the epistemic stance about realist philosophy. right? It's about how you understand the real. Realist interviews can be one piece of that, but they don't absolutely have to be the core thing that you focus on. So I personally took offense when my trainer said to somebody that she couldn't call it realist evaluation because she hadn't done realist interviews. You could only call it realist inspired. And I went, I would be proud to call myself realist inspired because I don't think realist interviews are a particularly good idea most of the time. And so you should, I think, feel empowered to do the same thing for whichever expert has told you this is correct practice. You should question it, but consider what might be the reasons why they thought it was a good idea to do that. Because there are usually some good and some bad reasons why methods are as they are. And it's a question of distinguishing, I think, between those good and the well-reasoned and poorly reasoned reasons for the setups that we have and evolve. Methods are supposed to evolve, and I think they have evolved and should continue to evolve into hopefully new combinations that fit better and are more coherent and more complementary. That'd be my take. Aristotle?
Yeah, Aristotle, coming from Greece. I think, I mean, just building on exactly what Tom has said, I think the key lessons, the key learning as we've started to look at different combinations is precisely to understand the purpose of those different steps or different tools or different moments, and then to be quite intentional about how you recombine them. So we're just repeating the same thing. In terms of what I was saying, promising combinations, I think this is where the field is at. So by Sri Lanka, what are going to be the promising OH-OM combinations that we might be talking about in the room that we might then want to codify, right? Because you've heard us talk about OM and OH examples. So we know that there are some promising ways in which you can bring the evidence test from process tracing into strengthening your substantiation and OH as one example that's already been codified. We know, I mentioned already, that some theory-based approaches such as contribution analysis are a nice, as Richard said, a nice kind of framework within which you can think about bricolaging in different causal hotspots or different ways. So bringing in realist evaluation where actually a generative causal framework is helpful for the particular question or the particular causal link is another one that we see quite a lot of. Bringing outcome harvesting into contribution analysis when you're looking for emergent outcomes and you want to then start looking backwards. So there are a few that have emerged from a small community of people that have been talking about this, but I think now is the moment to open that up and to really think about how does an MSc practitioner see the potential? So I like the fact that you guys, with your methodological kind of starting point of outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, are looking at this question of promising combinations. I think the other lesson, particularly from the work that colleagues in ITAD have done through various presentations they've made of their practice and debates and discussions they've had within ITAD about this, is that perhaps it's an obvious thing to say, but when you're evaluating large, complex, adaptive programs, there's much more space for bricolage, right? Because that iterative, evolving design space is there. But we've also had discussions, and Richard, you've been involved in some discussions about, but what do I do? Can I only do bricolage when I've got the massive evaluations, right? And I think the answer is no. And the point I was making before about thinking about bricolage as a way to minimize complexity in your design, which is something we did in a evaluation in the Netherlands, the team up evaluation, which I can see if I can put the publication in the chat, where we looked at bricolage in order to help us to actually get rid of certain methods because there was just too much going on. And that was a 6-month, 100K size evaluation. So I'll stop there. Richard, your hand is up, please.
Thanks, Marina. If I could just chip in just on exactly that point, because Julius, you mentioned the challenge of engaging commissioners in that conversation. definitely, and the utilization focused approach, evaluation approach, of course, is a great one for doing that. But the time and resource constraints doing bricolage when you just don't have that time window or the resources to put in for kind of a multi-year process. It's just 3 take-homes from my own reflections. Substitution more than addition. So don't try and do full methods with all the steps and then do another full method and all the steps. That would be more like mixed methods in my thinking. But try and think, okay, where can I swap out or substitute in? Plan ahead. If you plan ahead, you can use the resources that a program project has anyway for stakeholder engagement. So you can build theory of change, which you could then test. If you haven't had a chance to do that before, you could do that through over a year or two when you regularly do engage with your stakeholders, and use monitoring data for that if your monitoring data is suitable and good enough quality as well. So it doesn't have to be something that just comes at the end when you're doing an evaluation at the end. And then lastly, not rocket science, but treating an evaluation as internal, external, where your external are working with internal partners. The internals can do the context analysis. The internals can do data collection. It's not just, it doesn't have to all fall on the external evaluators' plate. So you can save resources and costs in that way as well. Just some personal reflections on that question, because I think it is particularly, one that particularly interests me and other kind of practitioners who don't always get involved in the bigger evaluations.
Great. Well, I think we have to draw the session to a close. But I think this has been a brilliant conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'll just bring Esther back in as well, just to join us as we finish. One thing I think I heard clearly is can we as a community of practitioners using outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, can we share our learning about bricolage? Maybe this is new for you and you're looking at your work through this lens for the first time, and maybe you can see, I did make some decisions in how I use these methods that we could describe as bricolage, and I can share what worked and what didn't work and what some of the challenges were, some of the learnings. So think about that, and get in touch with us if you have good examples, and hopefully think about coming to our workshop in Sri Lanka. I'm just going to put up a quick slide to share, because hopefully you're aware that we are hosting this event 1st to 3rd of December in Sri Lanka, all about bricolage, hosted by the Outcome Mapping Learning Community in partnership with IPID, with the Institution for the Institute for Participatory Interaction and Development, a local company based in Sri Lanka, and Emil is with us today, actually. Hi, Emil. And also in partnership with the Sri Lankan Evaluation Association. Welcome to SLEVA members who have joined us today as well. We'll be launching registration this week on Thursday, so please do keep an eye out. We'll be sending out announcements. There'll be registration open until the end of September, but we're also having a sponsorship application process, so do look out for that, and that will be open until the end of August. Maybe Esther's dropped off, but I will close us out. Thank you so much to our contributors today, Marina and Tom. Thank you for guiding us through this conversation, this fascinating topic. Thank you to Richard and Mariam for providing your insights as well. And thank you to you all for joining us, for sharing your ideas, your enthusiasm, and for engaging in this conversation. Look out for further online events, because we'll be having some more events as we lead up to our session in December. So keep an eye out, and hopefully see you at the next one. Bye-bye.